The Arctic. It's very, very cold. But people have been living there and thriving for thousands of years. How have people adapted to climate change in the Arctic through time? Dr. Bill Fitzhugh is here to shed some light on that today. Are there any more marshmallows? Wow! Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Live from Curious, Smithsonian Science How. Today, we're talking with Smithsonian archaeologist Dr. Bill Fitzhugh to learn how people have lived in the Arctic and how they've dealt with climate changes through time. Bill, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Maggie. It's great to be here.
So, Bill, before we can learn about how people have dealt with climate changes, we must first learn a little bit more about the Arctic and a little bit about what it's like to be there. So before you unpackage that for us, we actually want to ask our viewers what they think the Arctic's like. Think that's a good idea?
Great. Let's go.
Wonderful. So viewers, here's your chance to tell us what you think. What is the Arctic like? Is it cold, dark, isolated, inaccessible, or inhospitable? Take a moment to think about it and tell us what you think by selecting the answer you see in the poll window to the right of your video screen. Bill, we're watching the results come in together. Almost all of our viewers, 81%, think it's cold, but a large percentage, too, think it's isolated. What is the Arctic like?
Well, it's certainly all of those things. It's been peripheral to our knowledge for thousands of years as Europeans or Asians, but it's been the home for native peoples who've lived in the Arctic forever. And for them, it's not isolated, it's home.
It is home. So where is the Arctic positioned in the world?
Well, the Arctic is on the north, sitting on the top of the world. And here's a shot just showing you what it's like with ice all in the Arctic Ocean and all those lands just kind of surrounding it. So in a sense, the Arctic is a single region with communication from Asia all around through Alaska to Greenland. It's kind of like maybe a Mediterranean lake in the north covered with ice.
And when I think of ice, I think of this big impenetrable expanse. How do people actually travel across that boundary?
Well, they have learned to do this over years, and they've developed means like dog sleds and skin boats, snowshoes, and other ways to get around. It's if you live there, you develop these technologies, and the northern people have been really expert technologists.
So you mentioned traveling across ice. Is the entire Arctic covered in ice, or is there any kind of vegetation?
Well, in the wintertime, the sea is covered with ice, but of course the rest of the year, a lot of it is open water, increasingly so, and we have all these different environments. We have the green on this polar map here is the forest, north of that is the tundra, and then you have the Arctic Ocean. So you really have two different kind of environments. You have an environment which is the forest and areas for the caribou are living, the tundra without any trees at all, and then the icy coast where the seals and the sea mammals are really important.
So these three regions, the forest, the ocean, and the tundra, do they stay the same through seasons and through time?
They change a lot. I mean, the biggest change, of course, is the Arctic Ocean, which freezes with 1 degree change in temperature from an open water ocean to an ice-filled sea. Unbelievable change. But in other areas, the forest changes. There's snow in the winter and not, and the tundra is generally open. So it's an environment that people have learned to live in, and it's full of animals. It's a region that we're just starting to get to know.
So we see this graphic here with a tree line. Does the tree line shift?
Yes, the tree line has shifted several hundred kilometers north and south, especially west of Hudson Bay. In Russia, it's also shifted north and south. In cold periods, it's in the south, and then it migrates north in warm periods. But the biggest change is the changes in the ocean. It's the ice or no ice issue.
So tell us a little bit more about that, the shifts in sea ice.
Well, seasonal frequencies are, something that we're well accustomed to. In the north, the animals have adapted to this. Here you see a lot of walrus on a very little bit of ice. This is the story today. We're losing a lot of that ice. In the wintertime, the ice is expanded all the way down. You see on the light blue color here. And in the summertime, it's almost punching into the North Pole. And in another couple of decades, we're going to probably lose that in the summertime. So huge seasonal differences, and the animals have adapted to this, and the people likewise.
What's the importance of animals shifting with the sea ice?
Well, if you have a big expansion of the Arctic, sea ice, the seals and the walrus expand with it. And as that retreats in warmer periods, those animals, have to live further north. The same is true with caribou. The caribou we call the caribou kind of like the hardware store for the northern people. It's where they get their clothing, their antlers for making tools, sinews for sewing, food and so forth. The seals are likewise for the people like the Eskimo peoples. That's their bread and butter because they use them for covering their kayaks, for waterproof clothes, and for food.
So people are really dependent on the animals in the Arctic.
They wouldn't be there without the animals, and they still depend on them today, too.
Bill, you showed me a really amazing artifact here at the Smithsonian that we couldn't actually bring to the set that showed this intimate relationship that people have with the animals in the Arctic. Let's have a look. Bill, what are we looking at?
Well, this is a drum. It's a huge ceremonial drum, one of the largest that I've ever seen. It's made of whale stomach skin. That's the fabric of the drum. And then inside is a driftwood frame, and it's all tied together with sinew, animal sinew. So the whole thing is a part of the world that they're living in, the animals they hunt and the materials that they use to celebrate and honor the animals.
What's this image?
Well, this is the way they illustrated their life and their spiritual relations with animals. And they believed that by picturing hunters who are in the act of hunting animals, that the animal spirits would be more likely to give themselves to the hunter. These types of illustrations are present on many other kinds of artifacts, including food bowls, feast bowls, and even on clothing and so on. It all is giving this idea that people and animals are very closely related and that they have to talk together to be able to survive.
So Bill, as we saw in that video, it's clear through the illustrations and the artifacts that Arctic people have really close relationships with people. Now I'd like to learn a little bit more about the animals that live in the Arctic. Is there a lot of biodiversity?
There certainly is, but the key thing about the Arctic is something you could contrast with the tropics. The Arctic has very few numbers of species, but those species are present in very large numbers seasonally. The opposite is true of the tropical forest with much diversity. So the animals like the walrus and the foxes and other, they are there, especially in the summertime when there's a big bloom of Arctic, marine life. And so it's a very seasonal environment. In the wintertime, you have very few species to live on, so you have to cache food to survive. It's you have to tune into the seasons and to the animal movements.
So the migration of animals is also really important seasonally then.
Yeah, well, for instance, we know on the Labrador coast that the harp seals migrate between Greenland and the south. The polar bears move north and south. The caribou are big migrants in huge herds, maybe 800,000 in some of these herds, moving north and south. So people, have to adapt to intercept them and hunt them at certain times of year.
So are modern day people that are living in the Arctic dependent on animals like they have been in the past?
They are, indeed. You won't find any northern peoples, who have given up their traditional life with the animals here in Alaska. We see the continuance of the whale hunting tradition, and seals, walrus, caribou, and so forth. But of course, northern peoples today are modern peoples. they're shopping in grocery stores, but they have this continual, reverence for the animals and a need to keep their subsistence life going.
So Bill, revisiting our poll, the Arctic is really cold and it can be dark, but it's really a hospitable place if you're adapted to live there.
Well, we think of the wintertime as a difficult time to live. in the north, but actually this was the big ceremonial time for most of the Eskimo peoples. They had villages that came together, they had their ceremonial dances, and of course they were eating cached food from the summer, the fish and the caribou and the seals and whale.
Well, thanks for helping us understand a little bit more about how people live in the Arctic. Let's get to some of our text questions. We're getting a ton of them. So this one comes from Michelle and Ayla. They want to know, do people in the Arctic have food?
Well, yeah, Michelle, they do, you know, but they, as I mentioned, they sort of mix their economy between the modern economy and the natural game that they have. I've hunted and worked with a lot of northern communities. They're living a life like ours, but they also use the local resources, which are crucial.
Great question. So we have another question, but this one comes in by video. Let's have a look.
Hi, my name is Hope, and I wanted to know, why are there such large concentrations of animals in the Arctic?
Hi, Toke. Well, this is because of this pattern I mentioned, where the animals are there in great numbers seasonally or in certain migrations. So you'll have very large numbers of caribou, or you'll have huge herds of seals, maybe groups of whales. So there are large numbers, but they're only there at certain times, and you have to be there just exactly at the right time to get them.
So Maya and Alana from Canyon Ridge want to know, how can people survive in the Arctic?
People have survived for a long, long time in the Arctic, and they've learned to do it incrementally since the Ice Age. They've learned how to build houses out of snow, how to keep their food in frozen cellars, and so on. They've learned all sorts of new technologies that work with the Arctic regions. So it's something that has developed over a long period. But you know, the Eskimos and the northern people, they're great technologists.
So now that you've helped us understand that the Arctic is a place that people can thrive in, we want to know how people have adapted to climate changes through time. And before you tell us about that, we again want to ask our viewers what they think about this. So tell us, how have Arctic people been affected by climate changes? Not been affected, migrated, died off, acquired technologies, or changed practices? Remember, you can tell us what you think by clicking the button in the poll window that appears to the right of your video screen. Bill, we're both looking at the results coming in, and our viewers are really selecting most of the answers that were there, but most of them are picking changed practices. Tell us, where does our story start with people being able to adapt to climate change?
Well, this goes way, way back in time. By the way, you know, I hope there was a box for all of the above, because all of those are things that have happened in the North. And you know, there's a long tradition. People have continued, but in the same time, they've you know, developed different ways of approaching. Now, in the ancient days, 40,000 years ago, that's some of the first people who came into the Arctic. They were mostly land hunters. They were living in Eurasia, and you know, they were living in you know, in skin tents, using the animals and so forth. So they've adapted in different ways. This is the migration route that we see. People first adapted to the north in Europe and Asia. They learned how to hunt the tundra animals. They moved into North America around probably 20,000 years ago, maybe even earlier, down to the western part of the country, because there was glacial ice over the eastern part of Canada and northern Canada. And then they moved back up into these areas. So this was the first peopling, but later groups, Eskimo groups, Paleo-Eskimo groups, also came out of Asia and went into the Arctic regions.
So I see that the ice isn't always consistent throughout the years. When we're looking back 40,000 years, why is this ice growing and shrinking? It's almost like elastic.
Well, this is the climate factor, you know, and when we have interglacials, the ice melts, and when we have glacial periods, the ice builds up. And so here's 15,000 years. This is from ice core data. that gives us temperatures back into the ages. And you see this very cold period, you know, at the left-hand side of the slide. Then around 10,000 years ago, the world, the northern hemisphere, warms up, and it's been quite warm then for the 10,000 to 5,000 years ago. And then it gradually is cooling off. And so each one of those little oscillations, they affect the people in the north. And, you know, at times there was conditions like today with open water, and then other times when almost no open water in the Arctic, making it very difficult.
So Bill, you're an archaeologist. You look for evidence to learn about how people lived in the past. And while we'd love to learn about every culture that ever lived in the Arctic, we really don't have enough time today. So our story today is going to focus on your work in Labrador, Canada, and on 4 very specific cultures that we'll be walking through.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about 4 different cultures. The first is the Maritime Archaic Indians, who lived between about 8,000 and 4,000 years ago. Then a new culture, Paleo-Eskimo culture, shows up from the Arctic and ultimately Siberia. They're followed by the Dorset culture and then the Thule, who are the ancestors of the modern Inuit. So we'll sort of go through that history.
Let's start with the Maritime Archaic Indians. Can you tell us again when they arrived in Labrador?
Maritime Archaic folks got there around 8,000 or 9,000 years ago as the ice withdrew from the coast, opening up landscape.
So this was more like a warming period.
This is a warm period. It's probably the warmest period we've ever had until the modern days. And so there was very little sea ice. There was a lot of caribou hunting. People moved up from Newfoundland into northern Labrador, where they found some wonderful rock. This is what we call ramachurt. And it was the stuff that they used for making a lot of their tools. They were hunting both seals and caribou. They had a kind of an even subsistence. As you can see, they're sort of like a mixed forest and tundra environment. It was the first time that people ever really worked in this culture. And we have some examples here of some of their tools. These are stone axes and gouges that were used because these people made log canoes, dugout canoes, like the Northwest Coast Indians we know today. They also were master technologists, making stone tools. This is a ramachurt tool here.
They're beautiful.
They made a curved edge knife, which is kind of like an ulu here. So they were masterful technologists, and they also lived in very interesting ways.
How did they live? What kind of housing did they have?
Well, we didn't know what houses until we started doing the archaeology, and we found all these lots of places with lots of things in them, but we didn't know how to interpret it. When we got into northern Labrador, where there's very little soil, we could see the patterns, and you can see in this picture here a longhouse, a Maritime Archaic longhouse. These guys developed over 4,000 years from very small single-room houses to multi-room houses, maybe even, you know, for 20 or 30 families living way up north. And when we excavated them, we found in each of the little sort of apartment complexes, each little family group, a hearth. And then these very interesting soapstone carvings that were little pendants that they probably wore around their neck, kind of like a dog tag. Each one of them is different, and we think that the ideas for the designs came from dreams.
Wow, that's incredible. And what are we seeing here?
This is a Maritime Archaic cemetery, which we discovered down near Rigolet. They made wonderful, wonderful tools which were preserved in these cemetery complexes. Some of them are known very, very well in Port au Choix, Newfoundland. In Labrador, the graves didn't have any human bones in them, but we had just beautiful stone tools, and they traded these stone tools over thousands of miles.
You mentioned the stone axe that they used to carve out their canoes, which meant that they had access to trees. How do you know where the tree boundary was from 9,000 years ago? There's certainly no written history about that left.
This is what we're used to find out that. We have 2 different ways. This is charcoal, and we would collect the charcoal from the fireplaces, and we could immediately tell by the species of charcoal whether we were with trees, in trees or in tundra. And actually, we found out they were in both areas, but they always kept 1 foot in the forest. And we also had pollen diagrams from lake core sediments. So we kind of developed the history of the forest, and we discovered that these Indians moved north as the forest moved north after the ice, sort of withdrew.
So this is a story about how cultures shift in response to climate change. So this group, the Maritime Archaic Indians, must have been impacted by the climate shift that happened eventually. What happened after this
Well,
warm period?
there is, after around 3,500 years ago, the Maritime Archaic people kind of disappear. And we have other Indians, represented by some of the tools we see on the table here, that came after them. It was a time period when cooling, took place, and the first Eskimo peoples came from Siberia across Arctic Canada and moved into the north. And so this is the Paleo-Eskimo time period. You can imagine the surprise of the Indian people who were living there with no one else around, and all of a sudden out of the north come these people in kayaks and seal skins and so forth. Wonderful, wonderful tools. We see some of the examples here. They were master chipstone makers. They made barbed harpoons for catching fish, and very importantly, they had a harpoon, a toggling harpoon, which allowed them to very efficiently capture sea mammals, especially seals. So they were the first Eskimo peoples to occupy northern Labrador, and they were living side by side with the Indians.
Now, did they have the same types of houses, these long houses that we saw with the Maritime Archaic Indians?
No, everything about their culture was different. The spirits that they believed in, the stone tools. Here's a house, a Paleo-Eskimo house, about 3,000 years old. And you can see the mid-passage and the two family areas on either side. They were living in these things all winter long. No insulation, just a little fireplace there.
I don't know if that's the life for me.
They had some dogs, thank God. They had polar bears around too. So it was unbelievably hardy culture.
So they were, in a sense, coexisting in some capacity in Labrador. But did the climate change again?
Yes, it did. It warmed again. And we've sort of now moved out of that period into the Dorset period now, where around 800 BC it cooled off. We have what we call the Little Ice Age. And that's the Dorset culture, were the people who were the successors of the early Paleo-Eskimos. And we have some of their tools here, beautiful little scrapers, arrow points, and so forth. They developed a technique for keeping their houses warm with soapstone lamps, with cooking pots, and so forth. So they were really well adapted to the marine environment, whereas the Indian groups were still mostly stuck with the caribou in the forest. So two cultures side by side.
So this new group, the Dorsets, they were adapted to hunting these marine mammals, but were they also hunting on land?
Yeah, they did. Everybody had to use caribou for clothing, for winter clothing and so forth, and also for sinews. But especially the Dorset worked on the walrus. They were master hunters of the walrus. And as we see the technology changing, it changes from these small harpoons to bigger harpoons, more efficient harpoons. When you get into a big walrus hunting deal, you've got to have floats, you've got to have a really secure fastening to that animal. The toggling harpoon is the way to do that. So you see a lot of these things. There's a site in northern Labrador called Avialik, a very rare site where we got some wood preservation. Usually we only see stone tools. And we even see some of their clothing, the open parka. We can't figure out how they kept the snow out of their ears with that kind of a parka.
So this kind of evidence is really showing you how these people lived. But we know that our story today doesn't end with this Dorset culture. What happened to that culture once the climate shifted again?
Well, we had another warming period, and that's the same warming period that brought the Vikings across the North Atlantic. It brought Indians back north, replacing the Eskimos, quite far north in Labrador. They started using the Ramachurt that the Eskimos had been using, and so forth. And these are the ancestors of the Thule culture. And they arrived from Alaska as whale hunters. They come across Arctic Canada about 1300 AD, meet the Vikings, I think. They moved down the Labrador coast. They replaced the Dorset people. And they
replaced them?
Yeah, they seem to have completely replaced them. With genetic studies now show that there is no trace of Dorset in the Thule, genetic makeup, or in the modern day Eskimos, Inuit people today. So, a very different, another one of these waves of migration, climate inspired.
And is this an image of one of their houses?
This is a Thule house with a flagstone floor, and you see the little alcove in the back, whale bones around the side of it. So they were using the whales for structural members for their house. This is the Labrador Inuit people living the descendants of those early Thule people on the coast of Labrador. They developed really, really big houses, well insulated. And at this time, they were trading with the Europeans.
So, Bill, you showed me a really amazing innovation of the Thule people that allowed them to come to Labrador in the first place. Let's have a look. Bill, this is awesome. It's clearly a boat. What kind of boat is it?
This is a kayak, one of the real important inventions of northern people. Arctic peoples around the world develop these things so that they can hunt in the open water, sometimes extremely rough water in the Arctic Ocean. So they had to develop a boat that was capable of keeping the water out. Well, when you're making a kayak, you're using seal skins, usually bearded seal, which is one of the larger seals. The man made the frame, the woman sewed the skins and cleaned the skins and so on. Every year they would put new coat on it.
So was a boat like this used for hunting?
It's basically a hunting boat. You could sneak up on game very quietly, but they're also started a huge new sport. You know, so the Eskimo kayak has become the kayak that we have for competitive, racing and whitewater kayaking and so forth. So they've given us a wonderful vehicle.
It all started in the Arctic.
Bill, we saw there that the kayak was an amazing innovation to allow the Thule people to come to Labrador in the first place. And kind of to recap these 4 different cultures, we see that there was migration, there was extinction of the Dorset culture, but there was also this new technologies and changing practices that allowed people to deal with climate shifts in the Arctic. But we know that the temperature in the Arctic is changing again today. What are we seeing with sea ice decline?
Well, this is really dramatic. In the last 15 years, 20 years, there's been unbelievable changes in the sea ice patterns. We are predicting now that there will be almost no Arctic sea ice in the summer times by 2050 or something like that, maybe even sooner. And this is going to really change the lives of everyone. For the first time, Europeans are starting to get, the businesses, industries are looking for oil and resources. They're probably going to be fishing industries, which will expand into the Arctic. It's going to be the biggest change we've ever seen, and all because of that single degree of change in ice or not.
So what's going to happen to modern Arctic cultures today in the face of climate change?
With this long history we have from archaeology, we see how these cultures change. We see new waves showing up. We see them evolving, adapting new technologies, perfecting their harpoons, going from seals to walrus to big whale hunters, now adapting to industrial age as well. So the Arctic peoples will continue, and they will continue to need their animals. They need a pollution-free environment and so forth. They're great technologists. They will move with the tide, but they're going to be a lot of new vistas.
Bill, thank you so much for being here and helping us better understand the Arctic and the people who live there. And thanks for all of your amazing questions. Can you tell our viewers where they can learn a little bit more about your work?
They can indeed. Come to the Arctic Studies Center website, and you can also look at this book, Maine to Greenland, which the Smithsonian Press published last year. There's a lot of information about climate and culture change, especially in Labrador, Greenland, and even as far south as Maine. And sometimes we think of Maine as part of the Arctic.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you want to see this broadcast, it'll be archived later this evening at curious.si.edu. We hope to see you next time on December 10th with Ted Schultz on Smithsonian Science How.